Great. Hello, everyone. Welcome to OpenHour. I'm really excited today. We're going to be talking about applying aerial imagery and community mapping lessons from the Land Loss Outlook project on today's OpenHour. So I'm very excited to welcome several special guests today. Sarah Wiley, Scott Eustace, and Sophie. Can you pronounce your last name for me?
Spathariotti.
Thank you so much. Great. Well, I'd love to go around and just do a quick intros. I'd love to hear where your name, if you can, where you're calling in from, and then what brought you to this call today. So we have an idea of some of the highlights potentially to hit in questions and things like that as we move through the call. So I'll just go around my screen and just start with myself. My name is Stevie. I am calling in from Miami. And one of the things I'm interested in is I had heard and learned a little bit about this project in response to Hurricane Harvey. So I'm interested in seeing some of the evolutions and how it's looking moving forward. And then I'll pass it to Liz. Oh, also pronouns. Sorry, thank you. She, her for me.
Liz Barry, she, her, calling in from Brooklyn, New York. Really excited to hear updates from Cartoscope. Thanks for being here today, Jack.
And Mimi?
Hi friends, this is Mimi calling in from New Orleans. Today I am interested in, learning kind of a little bit more about how communities are using this information to, do things or learn or share things, and also to learn a little bit more about Cartoscope. And I am going to pass it to Alana.
Hi y'all, my name is Alana Moore. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm calling from New Orleans. I'm interested in this call today because I'm from home in Louisiana, so a lot of these issues of monitoring land loss in that area directly affects my life and my family's home.
Jeanette, are you able to go?
Yeah, thanks. This is Jeanette. She, her pronouns, are calling in from Bellingham, Washington. And I'm interested in learning more about the federal databases mentioned here, EarthExplorer and Cartoscope. Thanks.
And Liza?
Hi everyone, I'm Eliza. My pronouns are she, her. I'm calling in from Mid-Coast, Maine. And I actually am one of the research assistants on the project, so I'm here to kind of just support and participate. I'm excited.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, of course. I'll pass it to Greg.
Oh, hi, my name's Greg. Pronouns he, him. And I'm in New Mexico near Los Alamos National Laboratory. I'm really interested in learning about basically how to do mapping. I'm not familiar with these things like Cartoscope that you mentioned. So I'm just here to see how you do mapping and apply it.
And then Sarah, Scott, and Sophia, you want to take over an intros and take it over?
Sure. Hi, I'm Sarah Wiley, she, her pronouns. I am an associate professor at Northeastern University, and way back when, one of the co-founders of Public Lab with Liz, and this project, Cartoscope, comes out of a project that Public Lab began called MapMill. And so I'm psyched just to share where we've gone with this project today and the collaboration that we've developed with HealthyGulf to look at land loss. I'll pass it over to Scott.
Hey, Scott Eustace, Community Science Director for HealthyGulf, and here in New Orleans. And as part of HealthyGulf, the UCB Gulf Restoration Network, we've always had good partnerships with Public Lab to use aerial imagery and other methods to show the rest of at least the United States all the things that are happening on the Gulf Coast all the time. We don't have so many people on the Gulf Coast, but we've got so many interesting things that happen, from oil spills to islands moving from here to there after Hurricane Laura. And Public Lab, MapMill, and now Cartoscope Land Loss Lookout, I think, are ways that we can share what we're seeing down here about the very dynamic things that that are happening. So I hope we can invite you to look out for the coast with us. Sophie.
Hi everyone, I'm Sophie Spathariotti, she, her. I'm a PhD student at Northeastern University in the Computer Sciences department, and I've been working on Cartoscope for my dissertation.
So shall I just share screen, Stevie? And
that would be great.
Sure. So we put together just a brief presentation that describes the background of the project, why land loss is such an important issue in the Gulf, and we invite you all to give the project a try as we're going through here. I'll just drop the URL for the project in the chat.
I just did.
Oh, awesome. Thank you. So you can open the project and take a look at it there as we go through, and I'll just share my screen. Oh, I guess it's screen sharing is disabled, Stevie. Do you want to share screen?
Yep, hold on just a second. And let me see if I can. Okay, I've made you co-host. Let me know if that has changed things for you.
Great. Looks like it has.
Okay.
All right, can everybody see that okay? Awesome. So the project we're going to be talking about today is called Land Loss Lookout, and what we're doing is crowdsourcing for the first time, looking for patterns of different kinds of land loss in the Gulf of Mexico. And we're doing this on a crowdsourcing platform called Cartoscope, and I'll just describe a bit of the background on the platform and then pass it over to Scott to talk about the problem of land loss. So the platform that we're using is called Cartoscope, and it's funded by the NSF to develop a free and open source crowdsourcing platform, and primarily for nonprofits. And we're also funded to study ways that we might increase the enjoyment and engagement of participants in crowdsourcing tasks. And I'm particularly interested in how we can use these kinds of platforms to build community and membership engagement in nonprofits. And historically, Cartoscope has had an interest in looking at disasters response coming out of the original use of the platform in MapMill, which was developed by Public Lab. It was a fork of a tool that Jeff Warren, one of Public Lab's co-founders, developed this tool called MapMill, basically for sorting images after you have done a balloon mapping mission. And during Superstorm Sandy, he forked this tool to analyze images from disaster areas and developed a map basically very rapidly of areas that had been wiped out during Hurricane Sandy. And back in 2013, my work has been mostly focused on the oil and gas industry, and there were these catastrophic floods that people might have forgotten now in Colorado that wiped out a lot of bridges and knocked over a lot of oil and gas wells. And so we took that fork of MapMill again and used it to assess flooding and destruction of bridges following that Colorado flood. And then another test project we've done is looking at flooding of hog waste lagoons following Hurricane Florence in 2018. And we've also been using the tool to think less about disaster response, but more for other environmental problems that might happen on a slower, more longer term disaster, like algal blooms. So we did a project with NASA looking at algal blooms in Lake Erie, and this project we're looking at land loss in the Gulf with HealthyGulf. So in terms of, I'll just quickly review some of the research findings that Cartoscope has had. We can circulate this presentation, but here's a list of the papers, and you'll see Sophie's name all over the place here. She's been doing a lot of research studies through this platform, looking at how to improve engagement and enjoyment in citizen science tasks. And one of the things we've found is that requiring work of any kind actually has a negative impact and reduces engagement. We found that if you add variety into tasks, that increases engagement and enjoyment. And we've also been working on how you can look at participants' previous history, what they've enjoyed, and then customizing the kind of projects that they get based on their previous performance. And we're currently looking at how to build more collaborative engagement through the online interface. One thing that we're trying is just like leaving messages for each other as you've trekked through looking at a lot of images. So basically helping to share and increase the sense that there's other people working on these tasks together. And we're also developing an augmented reality version of this platform that you can play as a group. And we'll talk a little bit at the end of this project about how this could be used to do in-person data sorting and analysis. But for right now, let's talk about the goals of this particular project, which is really to support HealthyGulf and try and see how this can help build community with nonprofits. I'll pass it over to Scott.
Thanks, Sarah. Yeah, HealthyGulf is a 26-year-old nonprofit 501c3 educational and advocacy group from Brownsville to Sarasota on the nation's wetland coast. We have the Gulf of Mexico. We're formed long ago because we know that there's a need to watchdog a lot of the industry. We are the nation's wetland coast. We're also the nation's oil coast and industrial coast. And those things are often come into contradiction, especially in hurricane season. If you want to go to the next one. But we seek to unite people to communicate about what's happened to the exploitation of the abundant natural resources we have, and also what does the future hold. And we firmly believe that the future of the world's climate is happening right now in Louisiana and Texas with all of these plants that will change our climate. They're all being placed in the wetlands, which is unfortunate. Wetlands are really important, and sometimes it's hard to talk about wetlands. You hear people talk bad about swamps, and for the longest time, kind of Anglo-Western type culture didn't like wetlands. I think we've tried to change that in the United States, and we've recognized that wetlands provide a lot of food. But on the Gulf Coast, it's really the shelter. And just to get into dollars and cents in regards to the aftermath of Laura, Hurricane Laura, it was a very bad wind event, and tens of thousands of people are still without power. But we didn't see what we saw in Katrina, which is that wall of water move across the landscape, which really starts adding to the death toll, as well as the damage toll. So the wetlands in Grand Chenier protected Lake Charles from the 10 feet of surge that came from the Gulf, so that by the time it got to Cameron LNG, it was only 2 to 3 feet of surge. Now that plant was still out, it's still not functioning from the storm, but at least it wasn't a 10-foot wall of water, and it wasn't because of the wetlands. And I've got other figures. We have Laura is certainly a serious event with over 10 billion in damage, but it's not nearly as bad as it could have been because of the wetland buffer. Harvey and Katrina were easily $100 billion. So our wetlands protect us on the Gulf Coast, as well as feeding us. I do have a link where you can donate to Laura relief, because like I said, there's still plenty of people living in hotels in New Orleans, because I think we've only got about 30% of households have power back in Lake Charles at this point. And we've lost a few folks. There's still a need for Laura relief, but it's not nearly as bad as it could have been because the storm hit the wetlands. But we're losing them, which I think might be the next bit. We're losing them, and in the future we've had tremendous industrial impacts in the past, not only from things like Cameron LNG and the actual footprint of putting a 300-acre industrial facility in a marsh, like the United States likes to do. But all of the oil and gas wells from the 50s through the 70s that enabled the United States to, take a world leadership role led to the loss of a lot of the wetlands in Cameron Parish. That's the past, and our state is litigating against all of those companies, BP, Shell, Chevron, mostly Chevron. But the future, Bren Haas at Louisiana CPRA says that the 75% of future marsh loss into 2067 will be attributing to rising seas. Wetlands can grow in response to rising water levels, but only so fast. And wetlands, they can be drowned. They can be inundated to the point that the plants no longer grow. If the plants can't grow, the roots die and the land begins to fall apart. And we lose our wetland protection. The next one. And FERC, when we're the United States is making these decisions to place all of these, climate impacting facilities. This was a dissent from the commissioner who didn't want to put one of these LNG facilities in the marshes. At FERC, he said that, this facility, which would emit 8 megatons of carbon a year, would certainly have significant impacts. And, if you listen to Louisiana CPRA, that means significant impacts to our wetlands. And that 8 megaton carbon a year coming out of this one facility is more than most nations on Earth. And we've got plans for probably 10 of them, all in Louisiana's wetlands. So next slide. So we wanted to show, and then we say, hey, this was Venture Global LNG, that's the name of the company. You have to mitigate for the wetlands that you're going to drown with your carbon emissions. And they said there was no proof. That's basically what this letter from August 5th, 2019 says, that HealthyGulf hasn't proven that 8 megatons of carbon a year will drown the wetlands. So we were perturbed by that, and we wanted everyone else to see what we see when we look at the wetlands, is that they're slowly being drowned. So it's hard even from the boat to see that, and so we started Land Loss Lookout. We go to the next one. So with Land Loss Lookout, you're able to see an aerial view of the different things affecting, right now it's just Louisiana's coast. It could expand. Sophie, do you want to talk a little bit about the project selection and how it works?
Yeah, sure. So the general idea is that we have a set of images that we want people to look at and try to identify a pattern in the specific image. And more specifically, we have 6 different patterns here. There is the landing page, which is on cartoscope.p/landloss. Will take you to the main page for the entire project. And when you, there's a video that you can learn more about the project here. And once you click on the Get Started button, you get randomly assigned to one of the 6 patterns. And from there, you will see a brief tutorial about what you're asked to do. And then you will go through the images and try to identify those patterns. And then in the next slide, we see that we have 6 different patterns that we're asking people to look for. We have shoreline erosion, oil and gas, farming, shipping, restoration, and sea level rise. And we developed the tutorial with HealthyGulf to try to make it as clear as possible for participants to understand what exactly they're looking for in hopes to get some better accuracy from the crowd. And then in the next slide, we'll see that for this project, we are using infrared aerial photos for this. And I can pass it over to either Sarah or Scott to talk more about why we're using this type of imagery.
Right. You may be looking at these photos thinking, why are these marshes red? I thought marshes were green. And this is, we're using publicly available, what's called color infrared aerial photography. This is a little bit what your federal agencies look at when they're making governmental assessments or decisions about the wetlands. They use this because that near infrared, not the heat detection, not the Predator movie, but the near infrared part of the spectrum, water soaks that up. So it leads to a high contrast image between land and water, which in the muddy wetlands, often it's hard to tell. Where does the land end and the water begin? But with color infrared, even the green parts no longer look how they look. You know, if you were to go out in a boat and look at it, you can tell these shapes in the landscape, the patterns of land loss. And those shapes and patterns tell us a lot about what's happening. I think there's the next slide. So this slide just shows you, you know, there's the RGB image, and then the slider pulls it back. You can see the shape of the landscape much better on color infrared. Previously, you know, experts at USGS and other agencies have characterized these kind of highly expressive land loss formations. That's how they said it. You know, they got, you know, in the 90s, you didn't have video presentations. You didn't even have, you know, PowerPoint. They got 50 people, decision makers and coastal users in a room, and just put the maps up on a wall and had a discussion between the oil industry and environmental advocates and governmental types about the patterns of land loss that the maps of photography showed. We're trying to do the same, kind of repeat that study, but instead of putting, you know, getting a big wall, we have an internet, and we can serve you imagery from the USGS one at a time. So the picture on the left is different points and scoops, shapes of the land, which signify a certain coastal process, coastal erosion. And just to illustrate some of the things that, you know, what used to be exclusive to kind of experts, we're able to use the power of the internet to kind of introduce these processes to the public. And you can get trained in this kind of imagery identification. The USGS trains people every October to do the National Wetlands Inventory. But we've kind of like, I've been trained in that and I'm certified in that. So we just kind of try to condense down the basics into the tutorials for Cartoscope. There might be a next one. So previously, the USGS, the oil industry, and advocates identified, you know, coastal erosion as a pretty significant process, but also oil and gas impacts. And this slide just to illustrate that when you look at the color infrared imagery, the different geological and industrial patterns on the landscape create much different shapes. On the left, you have the force of a lake, you know, scooping and carving out parts of the landform that lead to those curved lines. And where I have the arrows, it's pointing to pointy red features, right? Because if you have erosion that's kind of scooping away at something, you end up with these points. Whereas to the right, we have a landform that's more impacted by oil and gas. You've got shorter branching canals where the United States drilled for oil. And then also in the circles, the canals create these impoundments that ended up drowning marshes outside of the footprint of the canals themselves. So you get these little ponds that start forming in the lower parts of the wetlands associated with the oil and gas canals. So that signifies impact from oil and gas drilling. So basically, the different processes have different patterns, and we are trying to train people to find them in the photography. But go ahead, next one.
Yes, and as people go through all the different kind of patterns that they're trying to identify, we are able to use the geolocation information from the images to plot those locations on a map with markers. And what you see here is, if you go to the main page of the project and go to the results tab, we've organized layers on the map based on the pattern identified, and we're showing which locations had a majority of votes saying that this image has this kind of pattern. So if you can zoom into the map, you can select different locations, different markers, and that will reveal the image on that location, and it will give you some more information about what people said on that image. And we have different buttons for you to go through the different patterns and see how the map actually changes, and where people are seeing sea level rise and where people are seeing oil and gas, etc. I think in the next slide is, so for up to date, we started it, we made the project public on the 24th, if I'm not mistaken. And the progress to date so far is we have 42 users coming in and contributing on average 47 labels and spending on average 32 minutes on the task. Based on data we have on the images, with images that have at least 2 labels and a 60% threshold for majority, users are identifying 25 locations tagged with oil and gas patterns, and 124 locations with sea level rise patterns. So our hope here is to get as many people as possible to contribute to the project so that we can get a wider coverage of the entire area, and hopefully be able to get some meaningful results as to where sea level rise is an identifiable pattern, where is oil and gas. And this is where you come into play. You can start playing around with the project by going to cartoscope.pe/landloss to try it out. We really want to see feedback, what things are working for people, what things would be helpful to get more information into, or make improvements or other changes.
Awesome. So we have some other slides about the augmented reality tool, but we could just hold here and have a conversation and hear people's thoughts on Land Loss Lookout. Shall I stop sharing?
Sure, that'd be great. Thanks. Great. So we'll open this up for questions or discussion.
Well, no question here, but just wanted to say thank you. That was a brilliant presentation.
Thanks, Liz.
Now that I've asked you to not to go back, I was wondering if you could pull up one of your beginning slides again. I think it was the one that showed the 6 different views. Yeah. And can you explain to me a little bit more about the difference here in the oil and gas one and the sea level rise one?
Great question. I think I can take a crack at that. So both of these have associated with them the ponding that happens because the interior marshes are becoming too flooded to survive. So they both have the circles, you'll notice. It's how we signified this kind of ponding, or it looks like Swiss cheese or encephalitis, or I think someone said, yeah, like a brain scan of someone suffering cognitive decline, or, you know, rather than the shipping photo, which has a very large straight canal that goes from one end to the other, but that red is pretty intact. There's not a lot of little ponds. Or the farming picture at the bottom left, which is relatively intact, but has a lot of furrows for drainage ditches that are necessary for agriculture. So, we, distinguishing between, is this pond created by oil and gas or sea level rise, is a bit of a difficult question. So I think that's why we designed the project to just say, can you see this pattern in this photograph? Because it's a bit beyond just photo review to determine, well, what's more important for that pond, for that ponding effect? Was it the local oil and gas canal, not allowing the water to drain, which built the water up high, which drowned it? Or was it the regional sea level rise effect, causing the water to remain too high on the marshes during the growing season? It's really, anytime you see ponding, it's hard to say, well, of course there's regional and local things happening at the same time. I think the characteristic image for sea level rise is one where we know we see ponding in places where we do not have oil and gas canals. So we know that there is some regional driver of water level, making the water level higher than it has been in the past. And we know there's cases where where this drowning is happening and there isn't oil extraction. So that top right photo is a place where there is, there are no oil and gas canals, or maybe there's one at the top right. But it's not enough to cause all of the ponding for the entire photo. So, I think that's why we separated the task into 6 different separate projects to see if people could perceive a pattern, yes or no, rather than, trying to foist upon folks at, the first time looking at aerial photos. We'll make a judgment, which is more important, which might be beyond the scope of just an aerial photo review. Did I answer the question?
Yeah, I think so. Okay. And then there was a question put in the chat. Greg, do you have the ability to go off mute?
Sorry, I'm eating. That's why I turned my picture off. Well, I just wondered, the 2 linear features, that channels. You mentioned that the oil and gas canals have a side effect of creating ponding, and I wondered why the shipping channels, which are probably bigger and don't create that. I'm guessing, do they line them with stone or something?
They do, but I don't think that's the critical difference. The critical difference seems to be that for the shipping channel, because they're bigger, they're more regulated. And all of these channels most of them are 50 years old minimum. So we're talking pre-Clean Water Act things, but there is still more regulation under Rivers and Harbors Act for the shipping channels than for the oil and gas canals. And what happened with the oil and gas canals was that it was just a drag line, right? You have a very small dredge that created the, let's say, 40-foot wide channel and just piled the material to the side, right? It's just a drag line or a excavator scoop, picking up the marsh, making it into a little channel for a drill barge, and then just piling the material to the side. Whereas a shipping channel was a bit more involved with bigger dredges from the Army Corps that didn't create those piles to the side, which we call spoil banks. The spoil banks would end up being, 4 feet high, which isn't very high considering, but in Louisiana, that's a huge water barrier. And so I think that pattern of spoil banks you see that much more often with the oil canals than the shipping canals. And it's those spoil banks critically that create the impoundment effects, according to well, really, Dr. Gene Turner is one of the lead authors on that, who's been studying this for 40 years. But so that's the critical construction difference between a shipping canal, which doesn't tend to create spoil piles, and the oil and gas canals, which do.
Thank you.
Oops, Sarah, I think you might be on mute.
Oh, I wonder if I could ask another question.
Sure. I was just going to say that one of the parts of the study is that we're going to be comparing expert assessments to the crowd. So we're going to be trying to see, how well does the training work and kind of replicate how somebody who's gone through, more formal training or years of training on this kind of work, how do they compare? That'll be one of our things we look at in our research paper. I'll just pass it over to you, Greg.
Thank you. I just wondered if you can tell from the images if there is current, like water current, and if so, what direction flows go. Can you tell that from the images?
Well, this is a, you can tell it from the images. This is a very flat landscape. So the waters tend to flow in many directions. We have, sometimes in Louisiana, the wind will change the water flow around. So because we're so flat, that's why we have these very sinuous rivers and bayous. You can look at the Mississippi River on the map and see the big meanders. So there's just tremendous variability in water flow. And so I think it's less that you'll see specific direction of water flow, because that changes a lot. And more, I think with erosion, you can tell that the water has been flowing, across the land feature in such a way that the land feature is reduced. And that's about, and you get more erosion when you have these, in the more exterior areas where you have these big lakes that form, but otherwise, the water moves in every direction, like a hurricane moving around. And so it's other than just the erosional effect, it's hard to tell the direction of water.
Thank you.
I just had another one about the oil and gas images. I'm wondering if over time you might expect them to start looking more like some of the others because of the effects that they bring in.
Right.
I'm wondering if you would I'm interested in hearing what your over time the output could look like with the changes in the landscape, or would responses change?
Right, I'll take a shot at that. Yeah, we considered, this is all just one time step. It's a USGS 2016 photography, because we thought, well, this is a bit complicated enough for people to see if they feel comfortable perceiving six different major patterns of land use change, in the landscape, just in a still imagery, without going through the complication of hey, look at this, and now we're gonna, do a swipe or something where you compare 2010 to 2016, or you compare, I think we were looking at comparing 2008, which was a good set of imagery for this area, and 2016. And I think it just got a little complicated, and we wanted to keep it simple, but certainly I would expect, the first image of oil and gas impact, you still had a lot of marshes. You still had a lot of red in the imagery, and the number of ponds were relatively few. Whereas the later one that we saw in the slides, the ponding was almost ubiquitous. That's related to, distance associated with the river mile. The further out the oil and gas field is, the more vulnerable it is to the marshes drowning. And over time, and so we've seen that. And so over time, the oil and gas fields in dissolvents is going to look more like what Venice, Louisiana looks like today. I don't know if that makes any sense. There's kind of a geographical, I wouldn't say north-south because everything's very curvy, but let's just say north-south for simplicity's sake. Over time with sea level rise, we do expect the more northern, more upland, you could say, oil and gas areas to look more like what the more distal, the more southern oil and gas fields look like now. But I think what we wanted to show also is that we're seeing these ponds in places where there's been no oil and gas extraction. So there's some regional thing causing the water to rise and the wetlands to drown. And so that's what we've identified as the sea level rise. If it is that important, as CPRA says, 75% of wetlands loss going into 2067. And I think similarly, you see less of that, the ponding where there's no oil canals. You see less of that the further north you go, or the further up the estuary you go.
Just to show a quick example of that, I think this is a reasonable example of what you were just asking about, Stevie, and what Scott's been talking about here, where you can see these big ponds and the oil canal coming up. And just to show you guys how you can navigate to see the results, you don't have to do the project from the beginning to see the results. You can, sorry, I've got my camera in front. You can just see the results from the homepage here, and that'll take you to being able to see all the different patterns kind of appearing. And one of the things I think is just neat is that you can distinctly see different patterns emerging from just the big scale view of, which is kind of neat. And one of the other things that we found really interesting as we were testing this was that there's actually a pretty high confidence level in a lot of crowd projects. Like, it might end up being 50-50 with people sort of voting both ways on an image. So like 60% confidence actually isn't terrible. And we were seeing things like up as high as 80% confidence and agreement among the crowd, which is really promising for a crowdsourcing project, because historically it's actually quite low, the agreement you get across a number of votes. And I don't know if anybody's interested more in like how we're structuring, the voting, and thinking about like what's a good confidence degree of confidence. But Sophie can probably answer questions on that.
Yeah, and I guess to add to that kind of discussion, and another interesting thing is the more people come in and the more labels they provide, it would be easier for us to distinguish which images are more challenging, so they're closer to the 50%. So this ambiguity can then, we could then say that there's a big set of images that we're pretty certain of which patterns are in it. And then for the more ambiguous ones, we can take a closer look into those, or experts can take a closer look into those and try to analyze what is so challenging for the crowd. And perhaps one of these images could turn into an example for the tutorial to better kind of inform people in the future of how these are kind of like corner cases or challenging cases, and how an expert would kind of view these. So that's another kind of, for me, kind of interesting outcome that we can actually, usually tutorials are static and that's it. You choose some images, you give some explanation, but that's it. But having the ability to go through these ambiguities can help us better educate and make better tutorials in the future.
And I know we're getting maybe about 10 minutes out, so I know, Sarah, you said you have something else you'd be interested in sharing. Does anyone have any more questions on this, what's been shared so far? Scott, I wonder if you could just give, and I think maybe you had hinted to this before, but what are some of the ways that HealthyGulf would use this data?
Well, I think we want to use it to respond to the company, you know, that they're asking for evidence that this is happening, even though everyone, even FERC and Louisiana CPRA says it's happening. I think we just feel gaslit maybe sometimes. So we just was like, look, we even showed it to people who are looking at the coast for the first time, and they said they could see it. You know, it is happening. You know, please stop denying climate change. And we just wanted to give folks a little insight to the government information that's out there available to them, you know, and especially the aerial perspective on our flat landscape. It may be hard if you're from other places, but people will, you know, we're a water people, and so we're out on the water in boats, and we everything is so super flat, we can't see these interior ponds from the boat level, right? Because everything is so flat, it just looks like everything is intact. So we wanted to introduce this concept that we are losing our wetlands through these little ponds locally, because even people who've had decades of experience on the water don't get that aerial perspective that the government and trained experts have, because they have access to this government imagery and they're literate in all of the the ways that it's produced and how to interpret it. So we're trying to do mostly an educational effort so everyone could see what we see.
Great, thanks.
Awesome. So one of the things that Cartoscope is also funded to try and think about is like crowdsourcing tasks can be pretty alone kind of work and can happen pretty independently. But we're also really interested in how you build community through data analysis and citizen science. So how can you make, how can you support people to be not just gathering their own data in citizen science projects, but to be really actively involved in data analysis? And so based on those kinds of questions, we started trying to figure out how to do in-person events that would involve this kind of image labeling. And so based on that, we've developed an augmented reality version of Cartoscope. And I'll pass it over, I'll just share screen again and pass it over to Sophie to explain how it works. We call it Tyloscope AR. And basically it involves these little tags that you can print at home or laser cut if you have that kind of capacity. And you can use your phone basically to project images onto them. So I'll pass it over to Sophie so she can explain a bit about how this platform works.
Thank you, Sarah. So yes, we noticed that a lot of these kind of online crowdsourcing experiences are kind of single player, as one might say, where one person comes in and they have no actual connection with other people going through the task at the same time. And we might be missing important information and this kind of discussion element between people that are doing things at the same time, which we found often prevalent in cases where you get together in a room and you look at images, or if each one opens a laptop and they start discussing things. So this is what we try to kind of bring into the entire task with Tyloscope AR. How it works is you have these tiles, and then you have an application on your phone. And you can get the application currently on Android by going to cartoscope.b/AR. And how it works is by using the application, you can point your camera over the tiles, and then you'll see on the left that the tiles become images. And then by using this kind of mechanic, you can select different images and try to sort images into different categories based on what the project could be about. There could be a project about animal identification or manure lagoons or whatever we want to work on. So here's kind of a quick kind of video of how it works. So you hover your phone over the tiles, and then you see that the tiles become images on your screen. And then you can actually start making selections by tapping on the camera button on images you feel belong to the same category. And this makes this kind of matching mechanism of collecting images. And for the next slide, we see how this kind of corresponds from matching multiple images in one collection to image labeling. We insert into the images that you see some images for which we know the true category beforehand. We call this the ground truth. So once you do that, there are 3 different cases. So you can make an incorrect match when you have at least 2 images in your collection that have ground truth that don't agree with each other. So you see in the first row, you have collected 3 images, but one belongs to category A and one belongs to category B. So we know that this is an incorrect match. Likewise, you make a correct match when all of the images that you have in your collection belong to the same category. And then finally, the very interesting kind of case here is the potential match, which happens when you have some images that belong to the same ground truth category. Here in the example, you see 2 images that belong to category A, and then some images for which we do not know the true value yet. So what happens here is that the person who is doing the image matching assigns some confidence to those images that they should belong to the category A. So once we have this kind of functionality, we can do a lot of different games or activities with this. And the cool thing about Telescope AR is that you're not forced to play anything specifically, but you can come together with other people or family or friends and design your own kind of activities or something that works best for you. We've tried, for example, asking people to play memory with this kind of set, where you flip the tiles face down, and then people go into turns trying to remember where categories are and try to make matches. Another thing that we've tried is we just spread all the tiles on a table, and then people are collectively trying to go through them and try to categorize them into different categories. And there's other things that you can do, like build collaborative games where everybody plays as one team and tries to reach an objective. And while you're playing these games, you're actually contributing labels essentially to those images. So instead of you on your own going into one image at a time, as we saw in the land loss project, another way to approach this would be, hey, let's get 4 people together in a room and start playing memory with this data set. And what we found here is that discuss a lot more what they're seeing. They can discuss the images, and they tend to talk about things that they might have a disagreement on and try to reach consensus on the spot, and also hopefully become more engaged in the long term with the project instead of going looking at the data set once and then not actually having a discussion with others about it. And this is kind of an interesting future direction for us as well. How can we get people more invested into the project by having this kind of conversation element?
Thanks, Sophie. So we're happy to take any other questions on that. And that's just another angle of the project that we're developing. And particularly, I wonder if it's interesting to grassroots mappers after mapping events, just as a way of kind of looking at the images that they've gathered and sorting them. So I thought it might be of interest to Public Lab for some of your other members' projects.
Yeah, Sarah, thanks. It sounds really interesting. I'd love to see a post on it on Public Lab that others might engage with it. Great. Well, we are approaching the very near top of the hour, and I was wondering if we could do a quick closeout round. So thanks so much, for sharing, and I'll just pass it around if anyone has any last things to share before we leave the call today. So just to Mimi. And
Hi guys, thanks for joining today. Oh, sorry, very quickly. Lots of new information for me, and I'll be looking forward to digesting some of it after this call. I am going to pass it over to Greg.
Well, thank you. Yeah, it's interesting, very interesting. Kind of reminds me of Amnesty International has a campaign, or did, I'm not sure, crowdsourcing to get help with looking at before and after photographs to determine bomb strikes on buildings, and I wonder if they could possibly use this approach.
Jeanette?
Yeah, thanks everyone for sharing, and lots of interesting content from you just here, and I'm actually excited to try it out. I'm going to do some labeling.
Alana, and then Liza.
Hey y'all, thanks for all the really good information. I'm really excited about this because my mom, who lives in Homa still, does that Zooniverse thing, which works just like this, where you identify universes from satellite images looking out. So now she can look at, like I said, her hometown. It's really cool, and I'm stoked to try and get at least one dedicated user on y'all's site for sure.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, that was just some really good feedback to hear, and I've been working alongside Sarah and Scott on the project, and your questions, I also learned a lot just from the questions that everyone threw out, so thank you. And I'll pass it to, let's see, who hasn't gone yet?
Why don't we go Liz and then Angelica?
Yeah, let's do that.
Yeah, thanks so much for this presentation. Yeah, it's really well put together project, and I want to encourage you. Thank you for working on this.
Angelica, are you able to go off mute?
Oh, I didn't really have anything to say, but I joined in late, but it was really nice to see how you're trying to build this community aspect with just like filling out these, like looking at these images, because typically you don't really get that opportunity. So it's really nice to see how you guys are developing and working on creating that.
Great. Kyra and then Scott. Kyra, if you're available.
Oh yeah, I just have been hearing a lot about this from Sarah and Eliza, so it's really cool to see this come to fruition.
Well, hey, I'll just thank you for looking at that stuff.
Scott, I think your connection's a little tough. Can you type in the chat? Oops, I think we lost him. Sarah, if you want to go ahead, and then perhaps Scott might jump back into closeout.
Oh, sure. Well, I just am thankful for the opportunity to share about the project. And for me, it's always really interesting to hear from Scott about this, because I don't know anything about land loss, and it's interesting to be involved in designing a project or a platform to support projects that are not in your wheelhouse. So, but the problem of land loss is just so dramatic. I mean, I can't wrap my head around some of the statistics. Like every 90 minutes, a football field of land is lost in the Gulf. And so, you know, if we think the storms are bad now, what we're looking at, you know, in the near future is just catastrophically worse. And so for me, it's just vital to keep public attention on this, and to really draw large scale attention to this issue before it's lost.
Thanks, Sarah. And Scott, unfortunately, we lost you and we missed your audio. Are you able to ping in again?
Well, I just thank you all for taking a look at this. And, you know, it can be just and the problem.
Scott.
It's still still a little bit rough. If you want to type in the chat. Oh, I think we're out. I'm
Our
pretty
robot
sure I
friend.
see you in there. All right, great. Well, we are at the top of the hour, and thank you so much for those able to stay a couple minutes over. We will post this open hour on the Public Lab Open Hour archive, so it's recorded and kept, and it will be there. We'll share the links as well, the resources that were shared by people, and stay tuned for the next upcoming open hour. So looking forward to seeing everyone again.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye, y'all.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you, everyone.